There are visions so strange, so powerful, that they ripple through centuries, echoing across faiths, philosophies, and even science fiction. One such vision began beside a canal in ancient Babylon, under a dull sky, where a young exiled priest named Ezekiel sat in silence. He wasn't just sitting by water, he was waiting without knowing it, waiting to witness something that would unravel the borders between heaven and earth. But before the visions, before the wheels and creatures and fire, there was only silence. It is here that our story begins, not with thunder, but with a quiet, unbearable grief. But before we go deeper into the vision of wheels, fire, and living creatures, if you're intrigued already, now's your moment. Subscribe to the channel to join others, diving into the hidden corners of ancient mysteries. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We want to see how far this story reaches. And if the mystery has you hooked, share this video with someone else who might need a reminder that even in silence, something sacred may be approaching. By doing so, you're confirming that you understand the mystery behind this title and you're ready to see it unfold. Now, let the mystery continue. It was the year 597 before the Common Era. Babylon, the greatest empire of the age, had crushed the kingdom of Judah. King Nebuchadnezzar's armies tore through the land, breaking the spirit of a nation. Jerusalem was desecrated, the temple plundered, its golden vessels carried off as trophies. The Ark of the Covenant, the very symbol of God's presence, was lost to history. Among the thousands dragged from their homeland was Ezekiel, a priest from the lineage of Aaron, trained to serve in the sacred temple, to light incense before the altar, to perform rites under the holy veil. All of that, gone in an instant. Instead of incense, he now smelled mud. Instead of hymns, he heard the sighs of a people defeated. They settled Ezekiel and his fellow captives by the Kebar River near Tel Aviv, a region of canals and swampland, far from the glory of Zion. The land was flat and featureless, drained of identity. But what crushed them most was not the distance, it was the absence of God. For the Israelites, God's presence dwelt in the temple, in the inner sanctum between the wings of the cherubim, above the ark. But the temple was gone. The Holy of Holies had been violated. Priests had no sacrifices to offer. There were no altars, no festivals, no holy days to keep. Many wept by the rivers of Babylon, refusing to sing the Lord's songs in a foreign land. Others grew bitter and cynical, whispering, "Has our God abandoned us? Are we alone now?" Ezekiel wrestled with these questions more deeply than most. His life had been a path prepared since childhood, ceremonial, sacred, bound by the rituals of the priesthood. But exile shattered that path. For 5 long years, he lived among the captives as a silent observer. He didn't preach. He didn't act. He simply watched as the hopes of his people withered like grass in drought. Every sunrise was the same. Flat horizon, grey sky, despair. But in the 5th year of exile, on the 5th day of the 4th month, everything changed. Not in Jerusalem, not in a temple, but by a muddy river in a land of confusion. It was a day like any other, or it should have been. Ezekiel may have been praying, or perhaps he was just lost in memory, staring at the sky, and then he felt it before he saw it. A shift in the wind. Not a breeze, but a force, a presence. A storm began to rise from the north. Not a natural storm, no ordinary cloud. The wind roared, the sky darkened, and a searing light blazed from within the cloud. It was fire, but not earthly fire. It pulsated, folded inward, flickered in colors no Hebrew tongue had names for. Ezekiel's breath caught. He could not move. He could not speak. It was as though the boundaries of space had opened before him. He was no longer just a man by a river. He was standing at the edge of another realm. This was not merely a storm. It was a chariot of glory, a throne on fire, a breach between dimensions. The sound grew louder, like the roar of a waterfall, or the shouting of armies, or the breath of creation itself. Every hair on Ezekiel's body stood on end. Something was coming, someone. And it wasn't a vision conjured by grief or trauma. This was real. And yet it would defy every description he would attempt for the rest of his life. The best he could do was reach for the word like. The light was like lightning. The beings were like burning bronze. The voice was like many waters. Because human language buckled under the weight of what he saw. What Ezekiel witnessed that day would haunt, shape, and define him. He saw living creatures with wings and 4 faces. He saw wheels within wheels spinning with impossible precision. He saw eyes not just watching, but knowing. He saw a throne like lapis lazuli, radiant and terrible, and upon it sat a figure who glowed like molten metal, surrounded by fire and crowned by a rainbow. And then a voice spoke. It called him by a new name, Son of Man. It wasn't just a title. It was a reminder. You are human. It said, you are dust and breath, but I have chosen you. Ezekiel did not earn this vision. He wasn't chosen because of greatness or purity or strength. He was chosen because he was willing to see what others refused to see, to listen where others had turned deaf, to speak truth where others had grown numb. And what he would be shown in the coming years would challenge the assumptions of an entire nation. God had not been defeated. God had not been dethroned. God was not bound to a ruined building in Jerusalem. He was here in Babylon, among the exiles, among the broken, among the forgotten. This truth shattered centuries of thought. In the ancient mind, gods were territorial. The deity of Jerusalem stayed in Jerusalem. But this God moved. This God followed. This God appeared not in temples but in exile, not in strength but in sorrow. And what Ezekiel saw would become the foundation for visions yet to come, visions of dry bones rising to life, of rivers transforming deserts, of a temple that had not yet been built, and a throne higher than any king's. But it all began here, by the Kebar River, when the heavens opened and a priest in mourning became a prophet of fire. So as we begin this journey into the visions of Ezekiel, pause for a moment. Let the mystery settle over you. Forget what you know. Close your eyes and let the images come. A storm from the north, fire that sees, wheels that turn, a throne that burns, and a voice that still speaks. Before we go further, remember, this is not fantasy. This is what Ezekiel saw. This is what he recorded. And for over 2 millennia, it has defied interpretation and awakened awe. If you're already feeling the pull of this ancient mystery, take a moment now, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the rest of Ezekiel's strange, powerful journey. Then, comment below with where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Let's see how far this mystery travels. And if the title of this video drew you in and you now understand why, share it with someone who needs to hear it too. That way, you're not just watching history, you're stepping into it. The wind came first, not a whisper or breeze, but a force that struck like the breath of an unseen power. It bent reeds and rippled the muddy waters of the Kebar. It stirred dust into spirals that danced and vanished. Ezekiel could feel it in his chest, a pressure, a vibration, a presence. Something was coming. Not just a storm, not just weather, but an event, a tearing in the fabric of the ordinary. And from the north, the sky began to churn. It did not gather like a rainstorm rolling across hills. There was no warning of thunderheads creeping over the horizon. This came suddenly, as if the veil between two worlds had been pulled back. The cloud that approached was darker than any Ezekiel had seen, a great mass of smoke and fire intermingled, glowing from within with an inner brilliance that defied the shadows it cast. It was not black. It was not grey. It pulsed with amber, gold, bronze, colors that shimmered like the forge of a divine smithy. This cloud was alive. Lightning arced from its heart, not in straight lines but in arcs, as though the sky itself was being rewired. The light was not natural. It flashed and folded and curled, casting shapes onto the ground that disappeared before Ezekiel could blink. He could smell the air change, ozone, ash, and something else, something unnameable. It crackled, it roared, and in its center, it burned, not with a consuming flame, but a living fire. It moved with rhythm. It had direction. It had intent. And then came the sound, not a noise, but a wave. It didn't strike his ears, it struck his being. It rolled through the air like the sound of waterfalls tumbling down canyons, like 1,000 voices chanting in unison, like the slow grinding of mountains under pressure. It was the sound of movement, of glory, of the divine crossing into the world of men. Ezekiel fell to his knees. He had never heard anything like it, and yet he felt he had always known it, as if every whisper of thunder in his life had only ever been an echo of this. He could not look away. The storm approached with terrifying speed, and yet time seemed to stretch. Within the fire, shapes moved, shadows at first, flickering in the flame. But they were not tricks of the eye. They were not illusions cast by heat and light. They were real. They were coming. The storm was not empty. It carried with it passengers. And, as the fire drew near, the shapes stepped forward. 4 of them. They did not walk. They did not ride. They moved. They appeared. One moment they were there, and in the next, they were somewhere else. Like lightning itself, they cut through space in ways that defied human perception. Ezekiel's breath caught. These were not men. These were not beasts. These were something else entirely. Living beings, burning with a beauty and terror that froze him in awe. Their bodies pulsed with light. Their very presence shook the earth beneath his feet. Each had a form like a man, but not a man. Upright, yes, with limbs and torsos, but the proportions, the symmetry, the very material of their being was different. Their skin shimmered like polished bronze in firelight. Their movements made no sound upon the ground, and yet the air screamed as they passed. These were not creatures of earth. They had come from the place where glory dwells, where the throne stands, where the presence of God is not a metaphor, but a force that shapes reality. And their unity, that was the most shocking thing. They did not move as individuals. They moved as one, in perfect coordination. No one led. No one followed. They responded to an intelligence far above human comprehension. Each movement, each turn, each beat of their wings was like the stroke of a single instrument, playing the melody of heaven itself. The more Ezekiel looked, the more details he began to see. Their feet were not feet. They were like the hooves of calves, gleaming and smooth, shining with the same radiant polish as their limbs. And those wings, 4 on each being, 2 stretched upward, reverent, as if in praise, 2 extended outward, connecting one creature to the next. When they moved, the sound of their wings was like thunder breaking across mountains. When they stood still, their wings formed a covering above them, a canopy of fire and reverence. It was a vision of holiness too pure for words. But even then, the fire grew brighter. The sound swelled further, because the creatures were only the beginning. Ezekiel's eyes, wide and overwhelmed, tried to take in everything at once, and then he saw it. The fire in the middle of the storm did not merely glow, it flashed back and forth between the creatures. It flickered like torches tossed between them, not randomly, but with purpose, as if the fire had intelligence, as if it, too, was alive. It did not consume, it revealed, it did not destroy, it empowered. This was not chaos. This was order, divine, strange, impossible order. He fell forward, forehead to the dirt. He could not look anymore. He could not speak. Every thought he'd ever had about holiness, about heaven, about God burned away in an instant. This was not the God of stories or temples or memory. This was the living God. This was glory incarnate. And it had come to Babylon, not to punish, not to mock, but to reveal. Ezekiel now understood what no priest had dared to believe. God was not bound to a building. He was not left behind in the ruins of Zion. He moved. He pursued. He appeared where he was least expected. And when he did, everything changed. The storm had arrived. The veil was torn. The heavens had opened. And the one who thought he was forgotten had been chosen. The voice had not yet spoken, but already Ezekiel's world would never be the same. As Ezekiel dared to lift his eyes again, the 4 beings came into sharper focus. He had glimpsed them through fire, through smoke, through the torrent of lightning and wind, but now he could see their forms. And what he saw was unlike anything in heaven or earth. The creatures had the likeness of a man, but only in the loosest sense. They stood upright. They had torsos, arms, legs, but the resemblance stopped there. These were not mortals, not angels as he had imagined them. They were beings forged in mystery, sculpted by the mind of God himself. Each had 4 faces, facing in every direction, forward, backward, left, and right, so that no matter which way they moved, one face always led the way. The first face was that of a man wise, calm, thoughtful, eyes that searched the soul, a reminder of humanity's role as steward of creation. Rational and reflective, the second face was a lion, fierce, nobler, kingly, a ruler of the wild, its mouth fixed in an eternal roar, power and command radiating from its gaze. The third face was that of an ox, strong, steady, enduring, a symbol of labor, of sacrifice, of patience that does not break under burden. And the fourth, the eagle, sharp-eyed, swift, untouchable, soaring far above the world, seeing what no man could. In these 4, Ezekiel understood. These were not just faces. They were emblems of creation itself. Man, the image-bearer, lion, ruler of the wild, ox, servant of the land, eagle, master of the sky. But the message ran deeper. Each face reflected a part of God's dominion. Not chaos, but design. Not randomness, but order. It was a completeness, heaven and earth, tame and wild, seen and unseen. These beings stood as guardians of something immense. They did not merely watch over the presence of God. They carried it. They manifested it. The fire among them, the light that danced like sentient flame. It was not just for show, it was glory, and they were its bearers. Ezekiel's gaze drifted to their bodies. They gleamed like burnished bronze, but not the kind hammered by human hands. This was celestial alloy, metal and flame woven together. Their legs were straight like pillars, and at their base, instead of feet, they had hooves, calf-like, polished, radiant. They sparkled like molten mirrors, catching the firelight and reflecting it outward. Every part of their form seemed deliberate, sculpted with meaning. These were not creatures of nature. They were instruments of divine presence. Their movement was a wonder in itself. They did not turn. They did not pivot. They moved in perfect coordination in any direction the Spirit led, without hesitation or confusion. If the lion's face pointed north, they moved north. If the eagle's face pointed east, they moved east. They flowed like thought, like energy, and wherever they went, the fire followed. The radiant fire flickering between them danced like a living thread, connecting them in ways Ezekiel could not comprehend. But it was not just fire and metal that marked them. There were eyes everywhere, on their faces, on their wings, on their bodies. Hundreds, maybe thousands, not painted or symbolic but alive, blinking, watching, seeing. They did not move aimlessly. They followed every motion, every flicker of light. Eyes that missed nothing, eyes that judged, remembered, understood. Ezekiel felt as though those eyes had seen through him, as if every memory, every secret, every buried emotion he had ever known had been pulled into the open. And yet, there was no condemnation. He felt exposed, yes, laid bare before holiness, but not rejected. The eyes did not accuse. They understood. To be known by these beings was to be held in awe and trembling, but also to be seen with impossible clarity. Ezekiel did not feel destroyed. He felt overwhelmed. And yet, within that weight, there was a strange kind of comfort. Each creature had 4 wings, 2 stretched upward, touching the expanse above, while the other 2 extended outward, connecting each to its neighbor. When they stood still, the wings formed a canopy like the covering of a throne, a sacred tent of unity. When they moved, the sound of their wings was like the crashing of waterfalls, the rushing of armies, the roar of the Almighty. It was a sound Ezekiel felt in his bones, a sound that made speech impossible, a sound that replaced thought with wonder. And beneath the wings, extending from their sides, were hands, human hands, perfect in form, hands that held no weapons, only potential. They could build, they could create, they could heal. It was a reminder, though these beings were terrifying, they were not monstrous. They were purposeful, intelligent, servants of something far greater. Every detail, the faces, the eyes, the movement, the fire declared their origin. They belonged to heaven, not as residents, but as emissaries. They moved as one. Their synchronization defied natural law. No hesitation, no delay. It was as though they shared one mind. When one shifted, all moved. When one stilled, all froze. They did not communicate with words. They were bound by something deeper, and in their midst, the fire continued to swirl. It never dimmed. It folded upon itself, flashing from being to being, illuminating the scene with a light that had no shadow. Ezekiel's thoughts struggled to keep up. He had studied scripture. He had recited the Psalms. He had read of Moses' encounter at the bush, of Sinai, of cherubim embroidered on the veil of the temple. But nothing had prepared him for this. These were not symbols. These were not imagined beings from old hymns. These were real. They had come, and their presence meant something profound. God was moving. God was not absent. He was here. The priest who had mourned the destruction of the temple now saw with his own eyes that the glory had not been destroyed. It had relocated. The cherubim were not frozen in gold on the ark. They were alive, thundering across the sky, carrying the throne of the Almighty himself. And in that moment, everything Ezekiel thought he knew about holiness was rewritten. He would never forget their faces. He would never unhear their wings, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe what had no earthly comparison. But the visions had only just begun. As Ezekiel stood trembling, eyes fixed upon the four living beings, something else caught his attention, something stranger still. Something so beyond comprehension it would echo through centuries of interpretation and speculation. Beside each creature, on the ground, was a wheel, not a cartwheel, not a chariot's rim. These wheels glowed, they moved, and they defied everything Ezekiel had ever understood about form, function, and movement. At first glance, he thought them simple, but as his vision adjusted to the glory around him, he saw the impossible. Each wheel was actually two, one within another, intersecting at right angles, perfectly aligned, a wheel inside a wheel. They seemed to fold into each other, yet remain distinct. It was geometry made alive, a construction so intricate it resisted logic. How could one wheel rotate vertically and the other horizontally at the same time without collision or friction? How could they move in any direction without turning? And yet, that is exactly what Ezekiel saw. These wheels did not roll. They glided. They hovered. They shifted direction without pivoting. North, south, east, west, they flowed wherever the living creatures moved, obeying no known laws of motion. It was as if they existed in a space unbound by gravity or dimension, and they were massive, high, and terrifying. Ezekiel says, not terrifying in malice, but in scale, in significance. And then came the most chilling detail: eyes. Just as the creatures were covered in them, so too were the rims of the wheels. All around their circumference, on every surface, were countless living eyes. They blinked, they watched, they moved. It was not decoration. It was sentience. The wheels were not mechanisms. They were alive. They were aware, and Ezekiel realized, in awe and fear, that they were not mere transport. They were companions to the creatures, not separate servants, but joined to them in essence. When the living creatures rose, the wheels rose. When they stood, the wheels stood. When the creatures turned, the wheels did not need to turn. They simply followed, like limbs following thought. The spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. This revelation changed everything. In the ancient world, the idea of a god having mobility was unheard of. Deities were fixed to mountains, to temples, to carved images. But Ezekiel was seeing something else. He was witnessing the throne chariot of the Almighty, what later Jewish tradition would call the Merkavah, the divine vehicle. It was a theological explosion. God did not dwell only in Jerusalem. God moved. God traveled. God reigned not from a stationary seat, but from a platform of glory that could appear in Babylon, in exile, in despair. This was a God not limited by space or stone. The wheels within wheels became the symbol of omnipresence, of divine motion. Their ability to move in any direction without turning mirrored the truth Ezekiel was beginning to understand. God's will did not follow human maps. His presence was not confined. His spirit was everywhere. And the eyes, they were more than ornamentation. They were the manifestation of divine sight. Nothing escaped their notice. No injustice went unseen. No sorrow was hidden. It was vision perfected, a gaze that searched the hearts of men and pierced even the shadows of exile. And the wheels moved with sound thunderous, overwhelming. When they turned, a roar like rushing waters echoed through the valley. The same voice Ezekiel had heard in the storm. In the wings, now emerged from the wheels. It was not mechanical grinding. It was praise, proclamation, power. The noise filled the prophet's ears until he could hear nothing else. It was the soundtrack of holiness in motion. Ezekiel had grown up hearing tales of the chariot of God, the throne that had carried the divine presence across Sinai, the cloud that had filled Solomon's temple, the fire that had gone before Israel in the wilderness. But this was not memory. This was not story. It was reality. And it dwarfed every temple, every sanctuary, every altar. The glory of the Lord was mobile. It had wheels. Theologians would later ask, were these visions symbolic or literal? Were the wheels a metaphor for divine omniscience, or a supernatural vehicle beyond human science? Some in later centuries would even whisper of UFOs and alien craft, wondering if Ezekiel had seen something from beyond this world. The wheel within a wheel, the lights, the impossible motion, was it extraterrestrial? Or was it something older, deeper, more ancient than the stars themselves? Ezekiel never asked. He didn't need to. He wasn't trying to explain the mechanics. He was witnessing the majesty, and this was not chaos. The creatures, the fire, the wheels, they all moved with one will, one direction. They were not many. They were one. They were the carriers of God's presence, the engine of his appearance. It was divine order wrapped in mystery. To Ezekiel, it was proof. The exile was not a sign that God had been defeated. It was a stage for his revelation. The glory had not vanished. It had wheels, and it had come to Babylon. Even in our time, the imagery of wheels within wheels captivates the imagination. Artists have drawn them. Poets have sung of them. Mystics have meditated upon them. They represent a vision too large for the mind, too intricate for logic, a spiral of knowledge, of time, of sight and motion. They are the intersection of mystery and presence. And through Ezekiel, God was showing a people broken by exile that his eyes were still upon them. His glory still surrounded them. And his spirit could arrive anywhere, even on foreign soil. Ezekiel did not know yet what these visions would cost him. He did not know the weight of carrying glory in a world bent under grief. But he knew this. He had seen the chariot. He had heard the thunder, and the wheels had turned in his direction. Above the four living creatures, beyond the roar of wings and the thunder of wheels, something even more astonishing began to emerge. Ezekiel's eyes, already overwhelmed by fire, by movement, by living metal and watching eyes, were now drawn upward. There, stretched above the heads of the creatures, was a vast expanse, something like a crystal canopy, a vault of unimaginable beauty. It shone like ice touched by flame, clear and yet solid, suspended like a sky within the sky. It didn't ripple or sway like smoke. It held weight. It defined boundaries. It was the space between heaven and earth, between creature and creator. The wings of the creatures stretched upward beneath the expanse, not quite touching it, as if they dared not breach the invisible line. Ezekiel sensed its purpose immediately. This was the firmament, the same firmament described in the beginning of Genesis, the division between the waters above and the waters below, between the seen and the unseen. But this wasn't a symbol. This was structure. It was a threshold between realms, a stage for what came next. And what came next changed Ezekiel's life forever. Above the expanse was a throne, a real throne, not imagined, not metaphorical, a place of rule, of authority. It wasn't wood or stone or gold. It was something like sapphire, deep blue, radiant, flecked with light like stars embedded in the night sky. It shimmered with the weight of justice and the promise of eternity. The throne was not empty. Seated upon it was a figure, one who had the appearance of a man. Ezekiel's language strains here. He does not say it was a man, but the likeness of a man. It is the language of caution, of reverence. Because Ezekiel knew the stories, he knew that no one could see the face of God and live. Moses had only seen God's back. Others had heard his voice, seen fire, heard thunder, but to gaze upon the divine, that was beyond mortal capacity. Yet here, Ezekiel saw someone, a figure seated in majesty. From the waist up, the being radiated like glowing metal, hot as a furnace, blazing with the brilliance of holy fire. It wasn't fire that destroys, it was fire that purifies, that reveals, that transforms. From the waist down, the fire burned continuously, as if the being was seated upon a flame that fed on nothing yet never died out. Surrounding the throne, above and around, was a radiance, a halo, a circle of color that Ezekiel could only compare to a rainbow on a stormy day. But this rainbow was not faint. It was vivid, alive, more real than anything he had ever seen. It wasn't just beautiful, it was symbolic. Ezekiel immediately understood. The rainbow was the sign of the covenant, a reminder of God's promise to Noah that never again would he destroy all life with a flood. It was mercy placed beside judgment. It was beauty encircling power. It was a symbol of God's faithfulness even in times of wrath. The throne and the fire spoke of divine authority. The rainbow reminded the prophet that God's justice never came without grace, even in exile, even in Babylon. This entire vision, the creatures, the wheels, the fire, the throne was not random. It was revelation. It was glory. And Ezekiel says it clearly. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. The Hebrew word kavod, glory, is not just light or brilliance. It means weight, presence, the tangible, overwhelming nearness of God. And it had come here, to a riverbank in exile, to a priest without a temple, to a man who thought his purpose had been lost. That glory now stood before him, not in whispers or dreams, but in terrifying, tangible majesty. Ezekiel could bear no more. His knees buckled. His breath vanished. He fell forward, his face pressed to the earth. It was not simply fear, it was reverence, the kind of awe that melts the soul, that strips away every defense, every argument, every pretense. He felt the fire not only in his eyes but in his bones. This was holiness incarnate. And he, the Son of Man, the exile, the broken priest, was now in the presence of the living God. And then, from above the throne, a voice spoke, not a roar, not a whisper, a voice, calm, clear, purposeful, and it called him not by name, not by title, but by identity, Son of Man. The term would repeat over 90 times throughout Ezekiel's visions. It was a reminder, a grounding. You are man. You are mortal. You are dust. And yet, you are chosen. God had addressed Moses from a burning bush, Isaiah through seraphim, Jeremiah from within his mother's womb. Now he was speaking to Ezekiel from the fire, from the throne, through glory. The voice gave a command, stand up. Ezekiel could not, but the Spirit entered him. It moved through him like breath. It lifted him to his feet not by his own strength, but by divine power. This was more than physical movement. It was a metaphor for his life. He who had been bowed under grief, crushed by exile, had now been raised to stand before God. And now, the mission began. The voice said, I am sending you to the people of Israel, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. The words cut deep. These were Ezekiel's own people, his kin, his lineage, and yet God described them as obstinate, hard-hearted, deaf to truth. This would not be a joyful calling. It would not be met with welcome or applause. But God made it clear. Ezekiel was to speak whether they listened or not. Success was not measured in numbers, but in faithfulness. His task was not to persuade. It was to proclaim. God warned him, do not be afraid, though briars and thorns surround you, and you dwell among scorpions. The language was vivid. Thorns would scratch. Scorpions would sting. Rebellion would not be passive. It would bite back. But Ezekiel was to stand firm. And as the vision reached its climax, a hand appeared before him. In it was a scroll covered in writing on both sides, filled with words of lament, mourning, and woe. This was not a scroll of comfort. It was judgment. But before he could speak its contents, Ezekiel was told to do something strange. Eat this scroll, the voice said. Take it into yourself. Let it become part of you. For Ezekiel was not to be a messenger reading lines. He was to become the message. The scroll was not for holding. It was for consuming. And as he obeyed, as he took the scroll and ate it, something astonishing happened. The taste was sweet like honey, not bitter, not sour, sweet, because even judgment, when it is the word of God, is truth. And truth, even when difficult, is precious to the one who loves the Lord. The creatures remained still, the wheels hovered, the fire pulsed, the rainbow glowed, and Ezekiel stood, now changed, now chosen, ready to speak. This was not the end of the vision. It was the beginning of a life that would bear the unbearable and say the unspeakable. But he had seen the throne. He had heard the voice. And now, there was no turning back. Years passed after the throne, the wheels, and the scroll. Ezekiel, now a man marked by vision, walked among his people in exile, no longer merely a priest. He was a prophet, a messenger often met with suspicion, resistance, even ridicule. He performed signs that looked like madness to others, lying on his side for hundreds of days, shaving his head and beard, burning his hair, cooking food over dung. These were not the actions of a man trying to be understood. They were the actions of one obeying a voice far greater than public opinion. And though many did not listen, Ezekiel remained faithful. He had tasted the scroll. The word had become part of him, and the visions had not ceased. Then one day, in what seemed like a quiet moment, the hand of the Lord came upon him once more. But this time, instead of fire or thunder, the Spirit brought him somewhere different, silent, still, and deathly dry. Ezekiel found himself in the middle of a valley. At first glance, there was only emptiness. But as he looked closer, he saw what filled the ground: bones, thousands upon thousands of them, scattered across cracked, sun-baked earth, not arranged in skeletons, but broken, fragmented, piled in jumbled heaps. It was a graveyard without graves. There were no tombstones, no markers, no names, just bones bleached white by sun, stripped bare by time. Ezekiel walked among them. His sandals crunched on splinters of skulls and ribs and femurs. It was a place beyond mourning, a place where hope had decayed into dust. And then the voice came again. Son of man, can these bones live? It was not just a question about the bones. It was a question about faith, about possibility, about what Ezekiel believed about the nature of God. Logic said no. Dry bones do not live. That is the finality of death. But Ezekiel had seen the throne. He had heard the voice. He knew better than to limit God to logic. So he answered with humility, O Lord God, you alone know. 19, a million, and that was enough. The voice said, prophesy to these bones. Say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. It must have felt absurd to speak to bones, to address remnants of the dead as if they could listen, but Ezekiel obeyed. He stood in that valley, surrounded by death, and he spoke life. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones: I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons, make flesh grow, cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will live. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Exile. And as soon as the words left his mouth, the earth began to stir. A sound rose in the silence, a rattling, faint at first, then louder. Bones shifted, bones clattered, bones rolled across the valley floor and collided into order. Rib cages reassembled, spines straightened, skulls clicked into place, arms, legs, feet joint by joint, ligament by ligament. They came together. A vast army of skeletons now stood where once there was only desolation, but they were not yet alive. Ezekiel watched as tendons appeared, fibrous cords wrapping around bone, binding structure to purpose. Muscle formed over tendon, layering strength where once there had been emptiness. Skin stretched over muscle, smooth and flawless. The valley was no longer filled with bones. It was filled with bodies human in form, complete in appearance, but still lifeless, still silent, still breathless. And again the voice spoke, prophesy to the breath. Say to it, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. The breath, in Hebrew, ruach, the same word for wind, spirit, and breath, the very essence of life. Ezekiel lifted his voice once more and called for the breath of God to come, not just air, but spirit, vitality, animation. And then the wind began to blow. It came from every direction, not with violence, but with force. Invisible, but undeniable. It swept through the valley, entered the bodies, filled their lungs. Chests rose, eyes opened, fingers twitched, and one by one, they stood, not as corpse, not as statues, but as living beings, breathing, watching, standing, a vast multitude, an army reborn. Ezekiel fell to his knees, not in fear, but in awe. He had seen death reversed. He had witnessed the impossible. Then came the interpretation. God explained what Ezekiel had just seen. Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore, prophesy and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. O my people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live. Magidi, this vision was more than resurrection. It was restoration. Israel, scattered and defeated, exiled and despairing, believed their story had ended. But God said otherwise. The grave of exile would not be their resting place. The silence of sorrow would not be their final chapter. Breath would return. Spirit would be poured out. A people would rise again. And more than that, it was a glimpse of something greater, something eternal. The power of God to revive the hopeless, to restore what was lost, to speak life where death had reigned. Ezekiel's vision became a symbol for generations, for Jewish exiles longing to return home, for the broken who believed they were beyond healing, for the forgotten who feared they had been left behind. It whispered a truth that transcended its time, no matter how dead things appear. God can bring life. No matter how scattered the bones, He can reassemble them. No matter how dry the valley, the Spirit can blow again. This prophecy would echo centuries later in the teachings of Jesus, in the promise of resurrection, in the hope of eternal life. The Valley of Dry Bones became more than a story. It became a map from ruin to restoration, from silence to song, from dust to destiny. And for Ezekiel, it was another layer of calling. He was not just to speak judgment. He was to proclaim hope. He was not merely a prophet of warning, but of promise. The God who sits on a throne of fire and sapphire is the same God who walks through valleys of death and whispers, live, unders. After the valley faded, after the bodies disappeared and the wind calmed, Ezekiel found himself once more by the Kebar River, alone with the weight of what he had seen. But the vision was not a dream to be forgotten. It was a commission. He had been chosen to speak for the Most High, not just to declare what was coming, but to embody it. In a world where people ignored words, God called Ezekiel to speak through action. And so began the strange, painful ministry of signs, living parables, each one more unsettling than the last. God's commands were never simple. First, Ezekiel was told to build a model of Jerusalem out of clay, to surround it with miniature siege works, ramps, battering rams, camps, day after day. He knelt before this fragile sculpture of his fallen home and enacted its destruction. Then came the truly bewildering command, lie on his left side for 390 days. One day for each year of Israel's sin. When those days were completed, he was to roll to his right side and lie there for another 40 days, representing Judah's rebellion. He was not to turn. He was not to move. He was bound with cords as a symbol of captivity, forced to stare at the image of Jerusalem's judgment. Passers-by mocked. Children laughed. But Ezekiel endured, knowing that every uncomfortable hour he suffered was a message carved into time. Next came the food. God instructed him to eat bread baked over cow dung, symbolizing the defilement of Israel's provisions during exile. Ezekiel protested. Though obedient, he was still a priest, trained in dietary law, taught to keep himself ritually clean. God relented slightly, allowing him to use cow dung instead of human waste. But the message was clear. This calling would demand everything: comfort, pride, even dignity. Later, he was told to shave his head and beard, a shocking act for a priest. He was to divide the hair into 3 parts. One part burned in fire, another struck with a sword, the last scattered to the wind. Each represented the fate of Jerusalem. 1/3 burned within the city, 1/3 slain by enemies, 1/3 exiled. Yet a few strands he was told to tuck into his robe, a tiny remnant preserved, a small thread of hope. These signs were not just performances. They were proclamations in a language louder than words. Ezekiel became the warning. His body was the sermon. His silence screamed judgment. He had been appointed, not simply as a speaker, but as a watchman on the wall. That title was not symbolic. In ancient cities, a watchman was responsible for sounding the alarm when danger approached. If he failed, if he fell asleep or turned away, the blood of the people was on his hands. God made this charge painfully clear. If I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you do not warn him, his blood I will require at your hand. But if you do warn him, and he does not turn from his ways, you have delivered your soul. This was the burden Ezekiel carried. It was not enough to speak truth. He had to do it no matter the cost, even if no one listened, even if they scorned him. His task was not to convince, it was to be faithful. The people around him were hard-hearted. God himself had said so. They were not strangers to the covenant. They were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They knew the law. They had heard the stories. And yet their hearts were like stone. Familiarity had bred contempt. They had heard the name of the Lord so often that it no longer moved them. They wore religion like a mask, but their hearts were far from truth. And Ezekiel, stripped of status, robbed of temple rituals, had been chosen to pierce through that apathy. He was told not to fear them. Though thorns and briars are around you, though you dwell among scorpions, do not be afraid of their faces. The warning wasn't abstract. His words would sting. His presence would provoke. And he would be hated for it. But he would also be protected. His forehead would be made like flint, harder than stone. His spirit would be armored not in arrogance but in divine resolve. God did not promise ease, but he promised presence. Then came perhaps the hardest blow of all. Ezekiel was told that he would be struck mute. For a period of time, he would not speak to the people unless God gave him specific words. His tongue would cling to the roof of his mouth. He would be silent except when heaven broke through. It was as if God were saying, "You will not speak for yourself anymore, only for me." Ezekiel's voice became sacred territory, used only when charged with a message from the throne. For 7 days after his first vision, he sat in silence among the exiles. 7 days matching the mourning period for the dead. He sat by the river in bitterness, overwhelmed by the hand of the Lord upon him. It was grief. It was weight. It was obedience forged in fire. This was not a life he had chosen. It had chosen him. And yet, with each passing day, the vision burned deeper into his spirit. He remembered the fire, the wheels, the eyes, the throne, and he knew God had not abandoned his people. He was still watching, still speaking. When the silence lifted, Ezekiel began to speak, not with eloquence, but with truth. He prophesied against idolatry, against injustice, against the false hope that Jerusalem would be spared. He declared that judgment would come not because God was cruel, but because the people had hardened themselves against mercy. And again, he reminded them, "Then you will know that I am the Lord." That phrase became a refrain, not a threat, a promise. Everything, every sign, every sorrow, every exile would ultimately reveal who God truly was. And yet, woven through all the warnings was a thread of hope, a glimmer, a whisper, a promise not of destruction, but of transformation. For one day, God would take their hearts of stone and give them hearts of flesh. One day, he would place his spirit within them. One day, scattered bones would rise, and the exile would become a place of encounter. Ezekiel bore this burden alone, misunderstood, ridiculed, isolated, but he never turned away. Because he had seen the glory, he had eaten the scroll, and the word was now his very breath. Many years passed after the destruction of Jerusalem. The temple, once the beating heart of Israel's faith and identity, now lay in ruins. Its altars were cold, its priests scattered, its people in mourning. For Ezekiel, the ache of loss never fully left. Though he had warned of the judgment to come, he had also loved the temple with the heart of a priest. And yet, even in that sorrow, the visions never ceased. God was not done speaking. In the 25th year of the exile, 14 years after the temple's fall, something new, something stunning broke through the silence. A vision not of ruin, but of restoration. Ezekiel was taken again by the hand of the Lord, transported in a vision to the land of Israel, not to a city, not to the ruins of Jerusalem, but to a high mountain. There, spread before him like a dream carved from stone, was a structure unlike anything he had ever seen. A man stood there, his appearance like shining bronze, holding a linen cord and a measuring rod. He did not introduce himself with titles or authority. He simply said, "Son of man, look with your eyes, hear with your ears, and fix your mind on everything I show you. You were brought here so I could show you this. Declare everything you see to the house of Israel. Raise." And so began the tour not of ruins, but of rebirth. The bronze man measured everything: walls, gates, courts, steps, every length, every height, every width was recorded. The detail was extraordinary. Ezekiel had seen visions of glory, of resurrection, of wrath. But this was a vision of order, of planning, of design, a blueprint from heaven, laid out with sacred precision. Nothing was random. Every measurement had meaning. They began at the outer wall, 6 cubits thick, 6 cubits high, a massive barrier, not of separation, but of sanctity. Then they approached the east gate, facing the direction from which glory would later return. Its threshold was measured, its portico examined, its steps counted, each alcove, each side chamber, each pillar described with care. The gate was not just an entry point. It was a symbol of transition, from common ground to holy ground, from exile to presence. The tour continued through the outer court, where pavement gleamed and chambers lined the walls. On the north and south sides, matching gates mirrored the east gate's design. Everything was symmetrical, balanced, perfect. Ezekiel, though not trained as an architect, could feel the harmony in the design. It was not about aesthetic alone, it was spiritual. This was a place crafted by the hand of God, where every line and stone spoke of holiness. Next came the inner court. The gates were higher, and this time the steps were 8 instead of 7, an ascent within the ascent, a drawing closer to the sacred center. Priests would walk here. Sacrifices would be prepared here. Ezekiel saw chambers designated for offerings, grain, sin, guilt. Nothing was forgotten. Each room had a purpose. The deeper he went into the structure, the more he felt the weight of it, not physically, but spiritually. This wasn't just a building. It was a promise. The bronze man led him further still, to the altar towering, multi-layered, rising like a mountain in miniature. It stood at the center of the inner court, a reminder that at the heart of worship stood sacrifice. The altar had horns at each corner, just as the ancient altar of Moses had. These horns represented mercy, a place where the guilty could cling and find refuge. The man gave Ezekiel detailed instructions for consecrating it, offerings to be made for 7 days. Bulls and goats and rams, blood sprinkled, its fire kindled, not because God needed sacrifice, but because holiness demands preparation. And then they came to the temple building itself. It stood before Ezekiel like a vision carved from eternity. Its doors were open. Its pillars stretched upward like trees in a sacred forest. Its halls were wide, its chambers solemn. The man measured every part: the vestibule, the inner sanctuary, the side rooms, the walls. Everything was more expansive than Solomon's temple had been. This was not a reconstruction of the past. This was something greater. As they moved deeper, they came to the most holy place, the inner sanctuary, the cube-shaped chamber where God's presence once dwelled between the wings of the cherubim. It was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high, a perfect cube. The geometry of heaven, but there was no ark inside, no veil separating it from the outer chamber. Just stillness, space, a holy waiting. Ezekiel stood in silence. He remembered the stories, how the glory of the Lord had once filled this place, how smoke had driven priests from the sanctuary, how fire had descended from heaven. And he knew this vision was not just about walls and measurements. It was a declaration. God would return. His presence, once driven away by sin, would come back. The temple would be rebuilt not merely in stone, but in spirit. They walked around the entire complex. The outer wall was a perfect square, 500 cubits on each side. A city within a city, a holy district set apart from the land. And as they completed the circuit, the bronze man turned to Ezekiel and said, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet. This is where I will dwell among the Israelites forever." Because that sentence struck deeper than any vision Ezekiel had ever seen. This was not symbolic. This was literal. The glory that had departed would return. The exile would end. The presence of God would no longer be confined to memory. It would dwell among his people again. Not temporarily, not conditionally, but forever. But the vision was not only a future hope, it was also a mirror. The man told Ezekiel, "Describe the temple to the people of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their sins. Let them consider its plan." This vision was not just architectural. It was moral. It was spiritual. The design was meant to provoke reflection, repentance, a longing to return not only to the land, but to the covenant. Ezekiel was told to write down every detail, every measurement, every law, because this vision was not for him alone. It was for the exiles who had forgotten who they were. It was for a scattered people longing for home. And more than that, it was for every generation that would one day hope for the return of glory. The temple vision echoed forward through history. Though a second temple was built after the exile, it did not match Ezekiel's description. And so generations of rabbis, scholars, and believers looked to this vision not as memory, but as prophecy, a promise still waiting to be fulfilled. Some saw it as a literal structure to come. Others saw it as a metaphor for the community of faith. Still others saw it fulfilled in the person of Christ, the true temple, the meeting place of heaven and earth. But whatever its ultimate meaning, one truth remains. In the midst of exile, when all seemed lost, God gave a blueprint, not only of stone, but of restoration, not only of architecture, but of reconciliation. And Ezekiel, who had once wept for the ruins, now carried a map of hope in his hands. Ezekiel had seen the new temple's design, measured its gates, walked its courts, and listened to the promise that God's glory would one day return to dwell among his people. But the vision was not yet complete. The bronze man who had guided him through the sacred architecture now led him back to the temple's entrance. And it was there, at the threshold, that Ezekiel noticed something unusual, something small, almost easy to miss. Water, a trickle of it, barely more than a thread, seeping from beneath the doorway on the east side of the temple. South of the altar, it flowed quietly, unobtrusively, across the ground, but it drew his attention like a whisper that refused to be ignored. Ezekiel followed the water as it made its way outside the temple complex. The man led him through the outer gate, past the courts, and around to the eastern side. There the water continued, flowing steadily toward the desert beyond. The guide measured 1,000 cubits and asked Ezekiel to cross the stream. At first, it reached only his ankles, cool, clean, moving with a gentle pull. The man measured another 1,000 cubits. Ezekiel crossed again. Now the water rose to his knees. The current was stronger, more insistent, though still crossable. Another 1,000 cubits. This time it came to his waist. The stream had become a river. And then, after the fourth measurement, Ezekiel stood before a torrent too deep to cross on foot. The water surged forward, deep enough to swim in, wide enough to overwhelm. What had begun as a trickle beneath a threshold had become a vast river. The message was clear. This was no ordinary stream. It had no natural source. There were no springs feeding it, no rainfall to explain its depth. Its origin was sacred. It flowed from the very presence of God. And as it moved, it grew. The further it traveled from the temple, the more powerful it became. Life flowed from holiness. Holiness gave birth to abundance. The man turned to Ezekiel and asked, "Son of man, do you see this?" The question echoed with significance, because this was more than water. It was revelation. Ezekiel followed the river as it flowed eastward, down into the Arabah, the deep rift valley that eventually descends into one of the most desolate places on earth, the Dead Sea. He knew it well. A lifeless body of water, the lowest point on the planet, saturated with salt, so dense that nothing could survive in it. No fish, no plants, no birds hovered overhead. It was the definition of barrenness. But as the river from the temple reached it, something miraculous happened. The salty waters of the Dead Sea turned fresh. Ezekiel watched in awe. The lifeless waters stirred. They sparkled. They transformed. And suddenly, the impossible became reality. Fish appeared, swarms of them, of every kind. Fishermen stood along the shore, casting their nets, hauling in catch after catch. The shorelines, once dry and cracked, now teemed with movement. From En-Gedi in the west to Eneglaim in the north, the land buzzed with life. The sea that had symbolized judgment and lifelessness now pulsed with restoration. And still, the river flowed. Along its banks grew trees of every kind. Not just ordinary trees, but supernatural ones. Their leaves did not wither. Their fruit did not fail. Every month, they produced new fruit, 12 harvests a year. The leaves were for healing, the fruit for nourishment. These trees were not merely part of the ecosystem. They were signs of something greater, the eternal abundance that flows from God's presence. Ezekiel understood what he was seeing. The water was not just water. It was life. It was the Spirit. The same breath that had entered dry bones now moved across dead landscapes. The same glory that had returned to the temple now spilled out into the world, healing what was broken, restoring what was lost. And just as he had seen death undone in the valley, now he saw desolation reversed in the desert. But the vision carried nuance. Not every place the river touched was transformed. The swamps and marshes, the man said, will not become fresh. They will be left for salt. Even in the age of renewal, there would be boundaries, pockets that remained as they were, preserved for other purposes. It was a reminder that restoration did not mean uniformity. God's purposes were layered, intentional, mysterious. To the ancient mind, this vision was staggering. Water was life. Entire civilizations rose and fell based on their proximity to rivers. Deserts meant death. To imagine a river flowing from the temple, an unending, ever-growing stream that brought Eden-like abundance wherever it went, was to imagine not just a new world, but a healed one. Ezekiel was seeing the garden again. The source of this river mirrored the River of Eden described in Genesis, the one that flowed out of the garden and split into 4 headwaters. And the trees with their healing leaves mirrored the tree of life itself. This was not just a return to paradise, it was an upgrade. And the vision would echo across centuries. The prophet Joel spoke of a fountain flowing from the Lord's house. Zechariah foretold living waters flowing from Jerusalem. And in the final pages of the New Testament, the Apostle John would see what Ezekiel saw, a river of life, clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb, down the middle of the great city. On each side stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, whose leaves were for the healing of the nations. Ezekiel's vision was not about a single nation. It was about the destiny of the world, a world where death no longer had the final word, a world where the presence of God could not be confined to a building, a world where dry valleys and dead seas were no match for the flow of divine life. It was hope embodied in water, spirit made visible in current and stream. It was a picture of the gospel before the gospel had come. For the exiles who first heard Ezekiel's vision, it was more than comfort. It was a revolution of imagination. Their city was gone, their temple destroyed, their identity fractured. But here was a promise that God's presence would not only return, it would overflow. It would not stay behind gates and walls. It would surge outward, changing everything in its path. And for every generation since, Ezekiel's river has remained a symbol of promise. In seasons of drought, It reminds us that water still flows. In deserts of despair, it assures us that fruit can still grow. In dead places, be they cities, churches, or hearts, it declares that healing is possible, that life can return. And all of it began with a trickle. The visions Ezekiel received were not only of glory, restoration, and life-giving rivers. As breathtaking as the temple and the river were, God had one more revelation for his prophet, one that carried the chill of coming conflict. It was a vision darker than the valley of bones, more ominous than exile, and far more terrifying in its global reach. The vision of Gog and Magog, a vision of a war that would shake nations, amblampious, and once again reveal that God alone reigns over all the earth. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel again, commanding him to turn his face against a mysterious enemy named Gog, ruler of a land called Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. These names would have struck Ezekiel and his hearers with unfamiliarity and dread. They were distant peoples, from far northern lands, places beyond the edges of Israel's map, barbarians, tribes of uncertain power and violent potential. But their identity was less important than their purpose. They would one day rise as a coalition of evil, with one goal: destroy the people of God. God told Ezekiel, "In days to come, you will invade a land that has recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel." This invasion would not happen in the days of judgment, but after restoration, after the exile was over, after the land had healed, Israel would be at peace, its cities rebuilt, its walls down, because the people would feel safe again. But in that time of calm, Gog would march. Ezekiel saw it in vision. The armies came like a storm cloud across the land, an overwhelming force. Horses, soldiers, weapons gleaming in the sun. Allies from across the world joined Gog: Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Beth Togarmah. Nations from the east, south, and north united in a singular, sinister cause. They came to plunder, to devour, to destroy. The land of peace would be surrounded once more, but this time there would be no earthly defense, no walls, no alliance, no mighty kings to stand in the gap. Only God. When Gog attacks the land of Israel, the Lord declared, "My hot anger will be aroused." What follows in Ezekiel's vision is one of the most vivid BC 14s. Cosmic judgments in all of Scripture. A great earthquake shakes the land. The mountains tremble. Cliffs collapse. Every living thing, man, beast, bird, feels the force of divine wrath. Panic sets in. Confusion overtakes the enemy. The coalition fractures from within. Allies turn on one another. Their unity crumbles in a storm of bloodshed and betrayal. But that is only the beginning. God rains fire and brimstone upon the invaders' plague. Hailstones, burning sulfur. The sky becomes a weapon. Nature itself responds to the assault on God's people. It is as if the elements cry out against injustice. Ezekiel watches as fire falls not only on Gog's army, but even on distant coastlands, on places that supported the evil. This is not just a defense, it is a divine reckoning. And then God speaks, "I will display my glory among the nations, and all the nations will see the punishment I inflict and the hand I lay upon them. From that day forward, the house of Israel will know that I am the Lord their God." Liver, Rivri knows. The vision is total. The destruction complete. Gog's army is shattered. His name becomes a byword of defeat. The battlefield is so vast, so littered with the dead, that it takes 7 months to bury the bodies. The people of Israel turn burial into an act of sanctification. Markers are set, graves are dug, and the defilement of the land is slowly reversed. Even the weapons of war are dealt with. The people do not need to cut trees or mine coal. They use the enemy's weapons as fuel. For 7 years, they burn the shields, bows, spears, and javelins left behind, cleansing the land with fire. The numbers 7 months, 7 years, echo God's pattern of completeness. What was started in rebellion is finished in justice. For Ezekiel's audience, this vision would have stirred mixed emotions: relief that God defends his people, fear at the scale of destruction, wonder at how enemies beyond comprehension could be turned to dust, and over it all, a sense of awe that God does not forget his promises, even in the face of global chaos. Over the centuries, many have debated the meaning of Gog and Magog. Some believe Gog is a symbol, a personification of all evil that will one day rise against righteousness. Others seek to connect Gog to historical or future leaders. In Christian texts, particularly the Book of Revelation, Gog and Magog appear again, gathering for one final assault after 1,000 years of peace. There too, they are destroyed by fire from heaven. What is clear, across all traditions, is that Gog represents the final enemy, the last breath of rebellion, the climax of resistance against God's rule, and the outcome is always the same: defeat, not by the strength of man, but by the power of God. For Ezekiel, this vision completes a prophetic arc. He has seen the temple restored, the river flowing, the land renewed. But before the final peace, there must be a reckoning. Evil cannot be ignored. Injustice must be answered. But judgment, in God's hands, is never chaos. It is precise, purposeful, and redemptive. The war with Gog is terrifying, but it is not the end. It is a door to something better. After the smoke clears, after the land is cleansed, God says, "I will now restore the fortunes of Jacob. I will have compassion on all the people of Israel, and I will be zealous for my holy name. They will forget their shame and all the unfaithfulness they showed me." And then the final promise: "I will pour out my spirit on the house of Israel." Unwell. End quote. The war gives way to peace. The storm gives way to spirit. Gog falls, and God remains. To every generation, the story of Gog and Magog stands as both a warning and a comfort. A warning that evil will rise, that there will be moments when darkness seems to win, but also a comfort that no matter how vast the army, how unified the enemy, how hopeless the moment, God will have the final word, and that word will be glory. Ezekiel lived out the rest of his life in exile. He never returned to Jerusalem. He never walked again within the courts of the temple he had once trained to serve. His homeland remained far away. A memory echoed in his visions. Tradition says he died near the banks of the Euphrates River, buried in a foreign land, a prophet in a place not his own. Some say he was martyred, struck down by the very people he tried to warn, silenced because his words were too sharp, too true, too unwilling to flatter, whether killed or simply passed into old age. Ezekiel's death marked the end of a lonely, extraordinary life. But his voice did not die with him. His scroll, filled with visions, lamentations, prophecies, and impossible hope, became a cornerstone of Jewish thought. It was copied, preserved, and passed down across generations. His vision of dry bones rising became a powerful symbol, especially for a people who, throughout history, have known exile, scattering, and the loss of home, in synagogues and study halls, in whispered prayers beside crumbling walls and hopeful songs on new soil. Ezekiel's words continued to breathe life. When the exiles eventually returned to Judah and began to rebuild the Second Temple, they carried Ezekiel's visions with them, though the structure they built did not match the magnificent dimensions he described. The promise he had spoken hovered over every stone. One day, they believed, God's glory would return, not just as smoke or light, but as a living presence that would never depart again. And so Ezekiel's blueprint remained not just a plan, but a prophecy. Centuries later, Christians too would read Ezekiel's visions with awe and recognition. They saw in him not only a prophet of ancient Israel, but a forerunner to Christ. Jesus called himself the Son of Man, a title that had echoed through Ezekiel's life, spoken by God more than 90 times. To many, the valley of dry bones foreshadowed resurrection. The river from the temple hinted at the living water Jesus promised to the woman at the well. The vision of a shepherd searching for scattered sheep found its fulfillment in the one who called himself the Good Shepherd. In the final book of the Christian Bible, the Revelation of John, the imagery of Ezekiel returns in vivid echoes. The 4 living creatures around the throne, each with faces of a man, lion, ox, and eagle, the wheels of fire, the expanse above the creatures, the river flowing from the throne of God, lined with trees whose leaves bring healing to the nations. Even Gog and Magog appear again, summoned for one last battle before the final restoration of all things. The book that began in Babylon finds its reflection at the end of the age. Islam, too, holds Ezekiel in high esteem. In Islamic tradition, he is often identified with the prophet Dhul Kifl, the man of double portion. His patience, his endurance, and his devotion to divine truth are honored. In Iraq today, pilgrims of different faiths visit a tomb believed to be Ezekiel's, a symbol of the legacy that transcends division. Artists, mystics, and theologians have wrestled with his visions for millennia. Michelangelo painted the Valley of Dry Bones. Stained glass windows in cathedrals across Europe shimmer with images of wheels within wheels, cherubim with radiant wings and burning eyes. In modern times, Ezekiel has become a figure of fascination not only in theology, but in science fiction. His description of creatures and wheels moving in impossible ways, of lights and sounds no earthly thing could produce, has inspired books, films, and theories about extraterrestrial contact. Some wonder, did Ezekiel see a spacecraft? Was it advanced technology? But these debates, while intriguing, miss the greater truth of what Ezekiel himself never questioned. He had seen God, and what he saw changed him forever. He no longer needed to serve in a temple of stone, because he had stood before the living throne. He no longer needed to offer sacrifices, because his whole life had become an offering. His every word, every silence, every strange sign act was part of a divine message, not just for his time, but for all time. His legacy teaches us that glory can appear in exile, that even in a foreign land, when everything familiar has been stripped away, the heavens can open. His story reminds us that obedience does not always lead to applause, that prophets may be rejected, isolated, even killed, but their words endure when spoken from the fire of truth. Ezekiel was not given easy tasks. He was not called to popularity. He was called to faithfulness. And he answered. Above all, Ezekiel's visions bridge the divide between judgment and mercy, warning and wonder. They show that God sees everything: the idols, the injustices, the rebellions, and yet still speaks, still calls, still sends messengers. Even when the people refuse to listen, even when they scoff or turn away, Ezekiel kept going. He had no choice. The scroll was in his stomach. The spirit was in his bones. The word had become his life. To anyone today who feels like an exile cut off from home, identity, purpose, Ezekiel whispers, God is with you, even here. To anyone who walks through a valley of bones, where everything seems dead and brittle and beyond hope, his vision cries out, prophesy, speak, the spirit can still breathe. And to anyone who fears that evil will triumph, that Gog will rise and light will vanish, Ezekiel reminds us, the Lord sees, the Lord acts, and the Lord will reign. Zizam, Men Medad, he was a priest with no temple, a prophet among rebels, a watchman who saw the sword coming and did not stay silent. His life was a warning, his visions were a promise, and his legacy is a bridge across centuries linking ruin to restoration, despair to hope, silence to speech. Ezekiel, son of Buzi, may have died in a distant land, but his words live. They shimmer with fire. They echo with wind. They rise with bones. They flow like a river, and they remind us that the God who opened the heavens once can do so again. That glory is never far, that the wheels are still turning. Among all of Ezekiel's visions, the valley of bones, the rivers of life, the temple blueprints, it is the image of the wheels within wheels that continues to stir the imagination of seekers. Two scholars, artists, and dreamers. It is a vision that feels too large for any one interpretation, too layered to reduce to a single explanation. Because in those wheels, in those eyes, in that impossible, seamless motion, Ezekiel witnessed something more than mechanics. He glimpsed the divine machine of the cosmos, God in motion, watching, guiding, beyond all comprehension. When Ezekiel first described the wheels, he was overwhelmed by their strangeness. Each creature had a wheel beside it, and each wheel had another wheel, intersecting it like a gyroscope with infinite pivots. These were not bound by direction or gravity. They could move any way at any moment, and they did so without turning. They were not clumsy. They were not clunky. They moved with grace, with purpose, with a kind of freedom Ezekiel could only marvel at. And within the rims, eyes countless, blinking, living eyes. In ancient Hebrew thought, the wheel, or Ophan, was associated with the angels who served closest to the throne. Later Jewish mysticism would call this the Merkavah, the chariot throne of God. It wasn't pulled by horses. It wasn't carried by men. It moved because God willed it to move. It was the visible expression of his omnipresence and omniscience. The wheels went wherever the creatures went, and the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels. It was one entity divided in appearance, united in function, and the eyes, those ever watching, never sleeping eyes, represented something deeply unsettling and profoundly comforting. Nothing escapes God's attention. Not suffering, not injustice, not hidden pain. The eyes were not passive. They were engaged. They recorded, they perceived, they judged, and they understood. For a people in exile, feeling forgotten and invisible, this vision was a thunderous assurance. You are not unseen. Meinen, problem to in 1040 point, woes, but Ezekiel's wheels did more than comfort. They disturbed. They fascinated. They defied every category. For centuries, readers of Ezekiel's writings have struggled to understand them. Were they purely symbolic? Or was Ezekiel describing something he actually saw? And if so, what was it? In the 20th and 21st centuries, new interpretations emerged, especially as science and technology advanced. Some began to ask, could Ezekiel's vision have been a description of advanced technology, of aircraft, or even spacecraft? The descriptions were eerily detailed, wheels within wheels, movement in any direction without turning, lights flashing like lightning, metallic brilliance, loud roaring sounds like waterfalls. To modern ears, it sounded less like poetry and more like observation. Had Ezekiel seen something technological, perhaps even extraterrestrial? Books were written. Theories exploded across media. Documentaries explored the idea that Ezekiel's wheels were some kind of flying craft, interpreted by a Bronze Age man with no framework to describe it. Perhaps the fire unfolding itself was an energy field. Perhaps the eyes were sensors. The movement that defied turning could match descriptions of anti-gravity propulsion. And yet, even as these theories continue to captivate the curious, most theologians return to something deeper. The vision, in all its mystery, was not meant to describe mechanics. It was meant to communicate presence, not the arrival of something from another planet, but the descent of holiness from another realm. Ezekiel was not recording a science experiment. He was falling on his face before the weight of divine glory. The wheels didn't just move, they carried. They bore the throne. They brought the Almighty to the place of exile. In other words, God doesn't just wait for us to find Him. He comes to us. He enters our broken places, and He arrives with sound and fire and undeniable majesty. The symbolism of the wheels also speaks to how God moves in history, not in straight lines, not according to our expectations, but with a kind of ordered unpredictability, like a wheel within a wheel. God turns events in ways we don't always see, until we look back and realize how perfectly it all fit together. The wheels are a reminder that divine action is both immediate and multidimensional. The creatures don't turn because they don't need to. God's vision is already facing every direction. And then there's the speed. Ezekiel said the movement of the creatures was like a flash of lightning. The wheels went wherever the Spirit went, no delay, no hesitation. This is not a God who is slow or distant. This is a God whose timing is exact, whose presence is never late, whose power moves with precision. In moments of crisis, in seasons of waiting, this part of the vision speaks volumes. God is not static. He moves. And when He moves, nothing can stand against Him. The wheels remind us of the mobility of God. For Ezekiel's contemporaries, this was revolutionary. They had believed that the temple in Jerusalem was the only place where God's presence truly dwelt. But now that it was destroyed, what did that mean? Was God gone? Was He confined to the ruins of the Holy of Holies? Ezekiel's vision thundered an answer. No. The presence of God is not bound by geography. The throne is not stationary. The chariot moves, and it had moved to Babylon. And this changes everything, because it means God is not only the Lord of the mountaintop, He is also the God of exile. He does not reside only in temples and cathedrals, but in refugee camps, in hospitals, in prison cells, in lonely bedrooms where prayers are whispered into the dark. He rides on wheels within wheels, eyes everywhere, thunder beneath Him, Spirit within Him, and He comes to us. In a way, Ezekiel's wheels are the ultimate image of hope. Strange. Yes, unsettling, absolutely, but also unforgettable. because they remind us that even when everything has fallen, even when we are scattered like dry bones, even when the temple is ash and the city walls are rubble, the glory of God is not gone. It has wheels, and it is already on the move. As the visions conclude, Ezekiel's life, like the scroll he once ate, has become both bitter and sweet. Sweet in the revelations he's been entrusted with, glory descending, bones rising, rivers flowing. Bitter in the burden of a prophet misunderstood, rejected, isolated in a land not his own. And yet through it all, Ezekiel has remained faithful, not because the road was easy, but because the calling was undeniable. Because once you've seen the heavens open, once you've stood beneath a throne blazing with fire and surrounded by rainbows of promise, you cannot walk away unchanged. The final message of Ezekiel is not a single prophecy or image. It is a tapestry, a vision in layers, a journey from judgment to restoration, from silence to speech, from a temple in ruins to a future where the very presence of God fills not just buildings, but the earth itself. It's a journey that speaks to every human heart, because every person, in some way, has known exile, has walked through a valley of dry bones, has wondered if the river still flows, if the glory still returns. Ezekiel's answer is firm. Yes, it does. God moves, he speaks, he sees, he restores, he resurrects, he reigns. The wheel within a wheel still turns, the fire still burns, the scroll still speaks, and the river still flows, bringing life to whatever it touches, turning the most bitter seas sweet. His visions stretch beyond his time, crossing boundaries of religion, culture, and imagination. They are not locked in the past. They are living, breathing, speaking still. In Ezekiel's visions, we are reminded that God is not far off, watching from some unreachable throne. He is close, impossibly close, a God whose throne is mobile, whose messengers flash like lightning, whose spirit enters dry bones and makes them live again. A God who measures temples not with cold calculation, but with covenant. A God whose glory departs when sin rules but returns when the heart turns back to him. And a God whose promises outlast even exile. When the people of Israel were carried away to Babylon, they thought their story was over. But God sent Ezekiel to say, "This is not the end. The bones will rise, the temple will be rebuilt, the glory will return, the river will flow, the land will be restored, not because they deserve it, but because God is faithful." That message has echoed across centuries. In times of despair, Ezekiel's words whisper, "Speak, even to the bones." In places of spiritual drought, they declare, "The river flows again." And in seasons when evil seems overwhelming, they shout, "Gog will fall." It's doers. His life is a testament that even the most impossible visions can come to pass, that obedience matters. That truth outlives rejection, that the God who appeared by the river in exile can and will appear again. For those looking for certainty in uncertain times, Ezekiel's visions offer not easy answers, but enduring hope. Not that suffering won't come, but that God is never absent in the midst of it. Not that exile won't occur, but that God travels with us. Not that judgment will never fall, but that grace always follows it. This is a message not only for ancient Israel, but for every generation that dares to believe that the impossible is possible, to believe that bones can live, that breath can return, that fire can purify, that God still speaks, And so we close our journey through Ezekiel's visions, not with a final answer, but with an invitation to see what he saw, to listen for the voice that still calls. Son of man, to watch the skies for the storm that carries glory, to trace the river as it turns deserts into gardens, to walk through the ruins and see blueprints instead of ash, to speak into hopeless places and believe that resurrection is still coming. For the God of Ezekiel is not distant, he is not silent, and he is not done. He still moves on, wheels within wheels. He still fills temples with glory. He still pours out his spirit. He still raises the dead. And he still makes all things new. So tonight, as the noise of the world fades and sleep draws near, may Ezekiel's visions echo in your soul. May the eyes that never close remind you that you are seen. May the breath of God fill your lungs with peace. May the throne above the expanse remind you that all authority rests in hands that are both holy and good. And may the river of life flow through your thoughts, quieting every fear, healing every wound, and preparing you for a new dawn. Because with God, all things are possible, even here, even now,